When I was a young chubby chubster, I couldn't get enough of video games, which kind of explains the first part when you think about it. Anyways, I was obsessed with just about anything that didn't require a lot of movement or effort, so naturally I was drawn to turn-based RPGs. For a good year of my life, I was all about a little-known game called Pokémon Silver. I'd take my Game Boy wherever I went and loved the heck out of hunting down Pokémon and grinding every single Pokémon to level 100 for some reason. This led me to get into other traditional RPGs like Shining Force, Wizard 101, and Final Fantasy VI. Though, as you might know, I'm not the biggest fan of traditional RPGs in current year. Particularly the ones where you go through a menu, you choose an action, watch an animation, and rinse and repeat. Part of the reason is that I have the IQ of a f***ing lemon, but another huge aspect of this is that a lot of these turn-based RPGs always felt too similar to each other. After you play one, it's hard to want to immediately jump into another because of the fatigue you feel from the last one. What further exacerbates this is how long these games tend to be. Since the combat is so simple and much of the narrative is left to text boxes, it leaves the developers with more room to stretch out the experience fairly easily. When I played Bravely Second, I had to force myself to complete that game. I felt so tired from grinding and doing the same sort of combat in the same sort of way again and again. There are exceptions to this, of course, whether that be Persona, Paper Mario, Undertale, or Fire Emblem, but they each have different elements in them that make them stand above the rest. Persona has such a visually appealing combat system and story elements of following a pretty engaging plot with a bunch of characters to interact with in a unique way. Paper Mario made the combat system have more player input with timing attacks so that it would reduce the tedium of selecting an attack, then waiting and then selecting another. It added some bits of action to the usual turn-based mechanics as well as having interesting characters and a cool presentation. Fire Emblem requires critical thinking to make sure every move won't end up causing your character to die permanently, which raises the stakes and maintains the player's attention for each battle. And Undertale is Undertale. Here's the thing though, these, among with other traditional RPGs I actually like, are out of the norm. It's sometimes rare to find a turn-based RPG that strives to innovate and do something totally different. Most get stuck in the same rut of progression where you fight enemies, grind, level up, and fight some more. For me, I always saw many of these RPGs based on numbers and the amount of time you were willing to expend, not necessarily your skill. It's like every battle in an RPG is a mathematical equation. There will be a definitive outcome because the mechanics don't allow for fluidity and other variables to be involved. Yes, critical hit chances mitigate this issue slightly, but the anticipation of a crit isn't something I get my rocks off to, you know? This is why I tend to like more action-oriented RPGs, because there, every fight's outcome is not set in stone. You can take on tougher enemies if you're skilled enough, and you don't have to grind if you can bear getting your ass beaten over and over. You can beat the Lingering Will from Kingdom Hearts 2 on critical mode with Sora at level 1. Sure, I can't even do that easily on normal difficulty, but it's possible. If you're fighting against Red from Pokémon Silver and you have a team of level 20 Pokémons, there's virtually no way you're going to win. It's basically impossible. That's not to say turn-based RPGs are bad. Pokémon Silver and the other Pokémon titles are among my favorite games ever. And I can appreciate the stories many of the older traditional RPGs told, like with Final Fantasy X. I just realized I called it X instead of 10, I apologize. Dragon Quest, Bravely Default, and the such. However, I guess I'm just turned off by them. I don't have the patience, the time, or the willpower to grind to advance in a game. It's just not fun, especially since I don't really enjoy the more traditional approach to RPG combat anyway. Like even with Wizard 101, a game I was addicted to as a kid. I got so frustrated whenever I had to grind for hours and hours to beat a really tough boss on my own. This is why I usually stray away from them, except on special occasions like Pokémon Sun and Moon or Persona 5, which are all because I feel like I have a weird obligation to play every game in the respective series. I mean, I'm already so invested into the franchise, so hey, what's another 40 hours of my life gone? Often though, I do like to indulge in something new if I get the chance. South Park: The Stick of Truth was was that something new I needed. South Park was the type of show I'd sneak into my living room to watch at 4 a.m. because my family believed it would turn me away from God and make me into a criminal. And I loved it ever since. I'm not like a die-hard fan of the show. I've just seen about every good episode the internet has told me to watch because I am a slave to the internet. See, the show brilliantly blends together nonsensical, boundary-pushing humor with actual themes and a competent narrative structure. Whether that be the spoof of The Lord of the Rings in The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, or the episode where the boys sing about fighting love as anime-style ninjas in Good Times with Weapons, it was a TV show ripe for being transformed into the video game medium. While there were other South Park games before The Stick of Truth, most were admittedly pretty shit and seemingly made for a quick buck as pointless shovelware cash grabs. The Stick of Truth, on the other hand, is anything but that. Developed this time by a competent studio, Obsidian Entertainment, and published by a, good company, Ubisoft, this game actually had a lot of care and thought put into it. Initially, I saw that it was a traditional RPG and was kinda taken aback. Ew, ick, there's something on there I don't like! As fate would have it, when I got around to playing and completing the game, I was surprised by how engaged I felt and how much fun I was having. I wanted to keep going through the plot points and keep fighting enemies. South Park: The Stick of Truth actually made traditional turn-based RPGs fun again for me. But why? Well, it has to do with the game's mechanics and story for the most part. Unlike a lot of turn-based RPGs, The Stick of Truth doesn't pride itself with taking anything too seriously. By the contrary, it constantly strives for the absurd and preys on societal sensitivity. This is made immediately apparent by the class system, which is Thief, Mage, Warrior, or Jew. Same goes for the Fractured but Whole that has a difficulty slider where the character gets darker the more difficult you set the game to be. This is the type of humor that South Park is known for, this dark, edgy humor that's fun to indulge in where everybody gets thrown punches. The writers perfectly satirize our culture and society with witty dialogue and plot points that are so nonsensical, they keep you engaged with the entire experience. You feel this underlying incentive to keep playing because you never know what the game will throw at you next in terms of surreal situations. You could have to fight gnomes under your father's ballsack or save the world by ASMR spoiler alert. Farting on someone's ballsack. I mean, the final boss encounter proudly displays a ballsack pretty much for the duration of the fight. It's fascinating to see these scenarios play out, and never does it become some form of normalized absurdity where you grow used to these aspects. Each one tries to one-up the other and provide interesting characters to interact with and maybe befriend. Some traditional RPGs suffer from this issue of overly serious stories that try to have some meaningful message behind them, but these often end up feeling contrived and unnatural. No offense to Kingdom Hearts, but it's sometimes hard to take that game seriously when you have Mickey Mouse joyfully telling us that the world will probably end. The Stick of Truth, on the other hand, is self-aware and consistently trying to make you laugh and just have a good time. If I wanted to sound like a pretentious fool, I could say that the narrative teaches us that ultimately nothing matters in the grand scheme of things, and we should just be content going through the motions. But ultimately, that doesn't matter either. As a result, this means that you feel a certain disconnect from the game, which some might say is detrimental for games to do. After all, isn't attachment and immersion generally seen as a beneficial part of any game? Well, in this case, it doesn't. By having your playthrough filled with nonsense, it allows the player to feel like they can just sit back and enjoy the ride. You don't have to think too hard about getting anally probed by aliens, it just happens and you gotta be cool with it. These are things that kept the experience fun and focused. Most quests are consistently good and don't tread on past, boring tropes. There's no artificial padding, it's as long and as short as it needs to be. Not to mention how South Park actually innovates the gameplay of traditional turn-based RPGs so that they're less boring and formulaic. Yes, the Stick of Truth is structured like a turn-based RPG. You pick a move, you watch an animation, something happens in terms of gameplay, and then the enemy does the same. What separates this RPG above the rest, however, is the execution of those mechanics. Throughout the game, depending on your class, you'll gain different abilities and moves, which some require PP or mana. While the core of the combat doesn't substantially change, These new abilities keep things fresh and interesting. These include such visually amusing animations like Butters becoming this pseudo-Thor-like being, and one where you can circumcise your enemies. Rather than swinging a sword to attack or using fireballs like a traditional RPG, you can instead swing a dildo or attack people with farts. Taking a page from the likes of Paper Mario, your moves depend on your actions during the combat. If you're doing a close-range attack, long-range attack, some ability, farting in your hand and then releasing it, blocking attacks, or just trying to increase damage or buffs, you can time a button press when you see a flashing light. Combine this with the actually interesting attacks and it maintains this sense of intrigue by everything the game throws at you. Plus, the fact that perk progression is often based on how many friends you gain along the way, meaning that you have to interact with the characters of South Park to improve your combat potential, is such a fascinating concept. I like that the game encourages you, through this small gameplay quirk, to continuously interact with the world around you, and since the world is filled with hilarious conversations and distinct characters, this never felt like a chore. It's technically grinding, as you do repeat the same sort of action to level up or perk up your character, but it doesn't feel like grinding. It wasn't something I forced myself to do, it happened naturally. Much of the game is like this, actually. Pacing feels natural and streamlined, it doesn't feel like there's unnecessary filler. Every part of the game, including the combat, feels impactful and has some sort of purpose. I found myself laughing along with the ridiculous storyline and different funny incorporations of South Park into the game. The characters and constantly absurd narrative that has several different plot points is so interesting and neat. Like I said before, I'm usually not one to find a lot of enjoyment out of turn-based RPGs, but South Park: The Stick of Truth really forced me to have fun and stick around until the end. The minimalist mechanics that weigh heavily on player input and how each fight has some new aspect depending on the enemies and bosses elevates the already high quality of the Stick of Truth. Oh, can we talk about those menus? Menus are one of those things that when done right can be so satisfying to sift through. I love navigating the menus of Square Enix games because they're so responsive and have these very euphoric sounds to them. The Stick of Truth is no exception, with its circular-styled menus and the technological main menu system that you use to keep track of friends, gear, and that kind of stuff. Altogether, this made up one of my favorite RPGs I've ever played. It innovates on these aspects of RPGs I actually liked and improves on things I didn't like. It made the gameplay into something that's well-paced and entertaining. The Fractured but Whole comes out soon too, so I have no doubt that Ubisoft will make that game as fresh as the first. At least I hope. As always, if you disagree or agree with me, let me know in the comment section below. I'm always willing to have a chat if you're willing to give me the time and not the anger. Thank you so much for watching and take care. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.